getting down to the nitty gritty here to make this super concrete for people. So we got a $30 billion industry. So there's a lot of revenue being generated with high profit margins by these big name journals. Like, where is the money coming from? Like what is the specific revenue that's being generated? Is it a high cost to publish that the researchers are paying? Is it subscriptions to the journal that many people are subscribing to, or is it?
So some of the revenue comes from subscription. A large part of the revenue comes from subscription, which means that universities and other institutions need to pay these publishers a lot of money in order to be able to have access to the papers that their researchers are producing.
And how are those prices determined? Is there sort of a free market where the prices are set by supply and demand, or not?
Well, in theory, it is a free market, but as I said, there's really very few big publishers, and that creates a situation that is probably more close to a cartel. So if you really had 50,000 players that are independent, truly independent, probably the prices would go down. But we don't have 50,000 players. We have 5, maybe 6, 7, if you add also the new mega journal publishers that are rising quickly. And therefore, somehow the prices have been staying at pretty high levels and allow for these large profit margins for these big players. So it's mostly, how do you kind of change that cartel situation? And to a large extent, it is about subscriptions. There's an extra layer, which is the publication cost, the article processing fees, where typically to publish your work in open access, and some journals are entirely open access, others are moving to become entirely open access, some are mixed, but people may still wish to have their work published as open access. They have to pay several $1,000s to do that. And in some of the top journals, they need to pay more than $10,000, more than $12,000, in Nature, for example, to have a single paper published.
So just to be clear for those listening, if in some cases, if you see a paper out there published in a place like a journal like Nature or another big name journal, if it's open access, which it may or may not be, if it's open access, that often means that the scientist who did the study, who led the study, paid thousands of dollars just to have it published so that it's openly available?
Exactly. Yes. Which means that money is removed from that scientist's budget to do research. You pay researcher salaries or consumables or other types of resources and effort. Often it would come from the funders. If it's public funding, it would come from public funding, meaning taxpayers. So there's a lot of double dipping here that people who profit from the system, they're gathering money from different sides and different steps in that process.
Yeah. So you're actually asking scientists to do peer review for free. It's like literally having an employee that you don't pay, and then they have to pay you to have it published, and they pay more if it's open access. And then it actually becomes even more absurd, you might say, when you start to think about it in terms of, well, over time, right? We used to have physical journals, used to, physically buy a journal and they would have to physically print it, but that's really not the case so much anymore. So the cost of the journal should be going down in that sense. And yet I imagine these fees have not adjusted.
Indeed. And if you have a cartel, it will not get adjusted. I mean, I think it will remain at a very high profit margin moving forward, no matter what improvements we have in technological transformation of the publishing enterprise, which indeed now can cost less because we can just do everything online. We can have things done much more efficiently.
Yeah.
So it is a big problem. It is a big black hole, in a sense, in the vicinity of science. It is absorbing a lot of scientific resources, and scientists by default are just offering more to that black hole. We're offering free peer review, as you mentioned. We are offering funds to make a paper open access. We're offering funds from our universities to to pay for subscriptions, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So there really is probably like a collective action problem here where if every scientist, every researcher just simultaneously demanded, hey, we need to be compensated for a time, even if it's modest, because that's just what we're demanding from you, something would happen. But of course, you need a critical mass of people to do that. And for various reasons, that's very unlikely.
Indeed. Yeah. And perhaps we should have someone from the publisher's side to to give a balanced view. I mean, I don't want to demonize publishers as being goodness, these horrible demons who are just making money out of good scientists and good institutions and good funders. I'm sure that they also offer some value and offer a commodity that is important.
Some value, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue of what we prioritize as a society, and what we feel is our legitimate enterprises and legitimate margins of profit. I mean, we have so many other enterprises, like, the tobacco industry is making a lot of profit and it's just killing people. So I think that I'm biased to say that we have a problem, and I think that publishers should be making much less out of what they do. But it would have been nice to have someone to give a counter argument that maybe we should have more of them and perhaps less of the tobacco industry or other companies that are really just causing death and wreaking havoc to society with no value.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, it's hard to even imagine workable solutions. So again, like hypothetically, you could imagine every scientist, gets on an email thread and we say, hey guys, tomorrow we're just demanding, $2,000 per peer review, no questions asked. Of course, that's not actually going to happen. What are potential workable solutions here? Is there anything on sort of the regulatory or funding agency side? I know that there's been some talk recently for things like, NIH funding to require open access. What are some potential solutions that could change how publication operates?
I think that there's many solutions, but I worry that most of them are not evidence-based. They have not been tested in some study, in some pilot study even, to try to see how they translate in action. So people have speculated and they come up with all sorts of proposals. Some of these proposals seem extreme to me and probably are going to be very damaging if implemented. For example, one proposal is don't allow a scientist to publish more than X number of words every year. Which means that probably many of the biases that we have with publication bias and extreme results having preference to be disseminated will become even worse, because everyone will be counting their words and goodness, I need to take my best shot and really impress everyone, my funders, my stakeholders, the community, consumers, whatever it is. So probably we'll have more bias if we say, we restrict publication and let's have less. Let's try to shrink the system somehow. There's other solutions that we know would work, but then we don't know how to implement them. I mentioned the example of using statisticians as peer reviewers. But then where do we find these statisticians? Where do we find these people? There's others that seem to cost nothing or very little, like preprints. I like those because even if we get it wrong, we're not going to pay for that. Preprints also have a track record of being very successful in the physical sciences already. So I don't really see a problem. And some people are concerned that, well, so you let everything out there and it hasn't been peer reviewed and people will use it for misinformation and disinformation. It will be all a mess. Well, that is happening already. And having peer review is not really that much of a safeguard. If you have something wrong, you can still be very widely disseminated.
So for those unfamiliar, a preprint is basically, if a group of a science group will do research, they will make a paper, and historically you would send that off to peer review, and if it goes through that process and gets approved, then it gets published in the journal. A preprint is the idea of you send in the draft to a preprint server in parallel to submitting it to a journal, and then it's public. You can see it on the internet. Anyone can read it, and it says, it has not been peer reviewed yet. And I guess the idea is this allows everything to get out there for everyone to see what's out there. And on the one hand, arguments against doing that might be, well, if it's not peer reviewed, then you don't have quality control. You might have bad research out there that then informs the public or misinforms the public. But on the other hand, if you let everything go out there in an open way, it enables everyone to scrutinize it. It helps get around issues where, just because 2 reviewers reject a paper doesn't mean it's a bad paper. Maybe a lot of other people would have approved it. And so there's those 2 sides to this, but the preprint is sort of putting it out there before it's actually going through a journal.
Exactly. And I like this. And personally, for most of my empirical papers, I would try to have them pre-printed early on when I feel that they're in a fairly mature stage, and I plan to submit them for peer review. But I mean, nothing is perfect. Even preprint servers would not accept everything. I think that medRxiv, for example, accepts about 75% of the preprints that are submitted and declines the others for various reasons, some of which may be legitimate. For example, they may be not original data. They may be more like opinions. I would argue it doesn't hurt to have opinions as well, provided that it is clear that this is just an opinion piece. And some others may just be rejected because they're felt to be potentially dangerous, let's say. So that's very tricky to decide, and even more so when supposedly a preprint server does not do any peer review. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. It allows something to be posted before any peer review. So rejecting something because someone who typically is not qualified to even judge the work, but just looks at the title and gets a gut feeling, oh goodness, I think that this may cause trouble. I'm not going to post it. I think that's problematic. So there's no perfect solution at the moment, and I think we should just keep trying different options, different possibilities, see how they work, try to map their strengths and their weaknesses, and do some testing, do some real studies, empirical studies, comparing different types of peer review, different types of publishing, different ways of reimbursement or of intervening in the status quo, and see what kind of a perturbation we get, rather than just say that, oh goodness, it's all wrong and it's so inefficient, let's dismantle it. Well, if we dismantle it, maybe it will become even worse. So I think we have to be very, very careful in what we do.
But one thing that seems clear here from listening to you, but also from my own experiences, the ecosystem as it exists right now is hackable in different ways. So because so much is citation based and publication volume based and prestige based, because you even have, as you mentioned earlier, predatory journals that will essentially publish anything without being true to the spirit of the peer review process, they're just trying to collect publication fees. You could have unscrupulous researchers out there, and to some extent you probably do, that they can just churn out mediocre paper after mediocre paper. They can self-cite themselves as many times as they want. They know that they can get it published at one of the 50,000 journals that's out there, and you can crank up your H-index or your citations through artificial means. Is the ecosystem facilitating that kind of behavior to any significant degree?
This is happening to a significant degree, indeed. And I think that different metrics are more easy or less so to be gained. And metrics like journal impact factor, for example, is highly gameable. And this is one more reason why I think it is not a good metric, besides other arguments that is at journal level. It is just an average and a highly skewed distribution. It is I mean, I can add probably 50 reasons why it's a bad
Mhm.
metric, but it is also gameable.
Yeah.
And the same applies to number of publications. Number of publications currently is highly gameable. It's very easy to publish papers,
Mhm.
very large numbers of papers in different journals.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think that metrics that are highly gameable probably should be abandoned. We should not be paying attention to them. And we should prefer metrics that are more difficult to game. Now, once a metric acquires more prestige and people respect it more, it is expected to be gamed more. So people will try to game that particular metric because this is how I'm going to be judged. This is how I'm going to be promoted. This is how I'm going to get funded. So people will try to look good in that metric as well. But some metrics are far more difficult to game compared to others. For example, number of publications is extremely easy to game.
Right.
H index is more difficult than number of publications, but it can still be gamed.
Yeah. Why is
So
just to make it explicit for people, why is publication number easy to game?
because there's 50,000 journals
Yeah.
that are
Yeah.
just waiting for you to submit anything and publish it.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
someone wants to submit 1,000 papers tonight, if they have the money to pay for that,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
can get 1,000 publications
Yeah.
by the end of the day.
The other
Um,
thing that I learned from my academic days was very often, you when you see a paper, there might be 5, 10, 20 or more names on it. Very often, some of those names are on there simply because they shared a reagent with someone else.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
there's lots of different ways to get your names on papers that don't that might not involve you really doing much of anything in terms of the research.
Right. So again, if we pay a lot of attention to number of publications, people will flock into the author's masthead. They will try
Mhm.
to become authors in papers that actually they have not contributed to. And that creates a further boosting of unhealthy ecosystems where the director or the professor will be an author no matter what on anything that comes out of the department, even though they have no clue about the
Right.
work that was done. And then also the associate professors. And then, and at some point, maybe everyone will be an author on everything, even though their contribution has been minimal or completely none. Um, so authorship is very easily gamed, and this is why I believe that it should not be taken into account in judging individuals or teams based on number of papers. I don't think that should count. If they have published one paper or if they have published 10,000 papers, both of them may be legitimate. So I'm not saying that we should penalize those who publish 10,000 papers.
Yeah.
Maybe for communicating their work properly and in sufficient detail, in sufficient depth, they need 10,000 papers. That's perfectly fine. Or maybe they can do it with one. I don't think that should be an issue. They should not get a better grade or a better salary or a better chance of promotion or more funding, depending on the number of papers. H index is less gameable, but it can still be gamed.
How is the H index computed? What is that?
So the H index is the number of papers that have received at least as many citations as the H index. so if an H index of 30 means that person has published 30 papers that have at least 30 citations each.
I see. So maybe you published 100, but some of them have less than 30.
Right.
Numbers telling you how many you have that are cited that much.
Right. 30 of them have at least 30. The most cited may have 30,000. I mean,
Right,
it
right.
doesn't say anything about what is the number above 30, but at least 30 papers have at least 30. So we know that H index is also gameable. It is gameable through becoming a co-author, an undeserved co-author in papers. And it is also gameable by people who create cartels that cite each other and then boost the number of citations. Sometimes it's so funny that they boost citations to specific papers so that they just increase the H index and they make the papers pass exactly the necessary threshold so as to boost the H index. And this is discoverable. I mean, you can see that. You can see that the distribution of citations in papers fits that gaming.
Wow.
So it is gameable, not as easily as just number of papers, but it is gameable. Total number of citations is even less gameable. because goodness, someone needs to find big cartels that are willing to
Yeah.
massively cite many papers. And then again, that gaming can be revealed. It can be detected. You will see papers that cite uh, some author 150 times.
Right, right, right. Or
And
there's a classic example in the research world, and many researchers listening will know what I'm talking about, where you submit your paper for peer review. Your anonymous reviewer will then request that you cite a particular reviewer 12 times, and one wonders if
right,
that was the person.
yeah, yeah. And then there's other metrics. There's co-authorship adjusted metrics like the HM index that corrects for co-authorship, and then you can look at contributions as first author, as single author.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at self-citations. You can look at orchestration cartel metrics that suggest that someone has been gaming citations. So I think that we can have metrics that probe into the gaming of metrics.
Yeah.
And looking at the full signature of here's a scientist whose
Yeah.
work is not quantified by a single number like number of papers, but look at these 50 numbers, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them clearly suggest that there's fraud going on here or clearly some overt gaming. I think that this would be more appropriate
Hmm.
to do. Um, it's a little bit like virus and antivirus software.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
come up with a new metric, and this can be gamed.
Right.
Then you have to come up with something that is
Yeah.
even more
There's
uh,
as soon as something
bulletproof.
becomes a metric for success, it stops being a good metric for success.
Right, right. So besides metrics, I think we need to look more broadly on other issues like citizenship, scientific citizenship, um, use of rigorous methods,
Mm-hmm.
transparency, openness,
Mm-hmm.
sharing data, sharing code, sharing protocol, registration, especially for studies that registration matters, and it's important to register your study ahead of doing it. And for example, for clinical trials, this is the default. And for some other types of studies, I think it would also be the default. And try to see how a scientist performs on these dimensions, which means that they're rigorous about their research. Again, there's not a single number or a single thing that would say, here's a good scientist or here's a bad scientist. The same applies to institutions, the same applies to journals and to other types of groupings. But having a more complete picture of multiple dimensions probably is more informative, and it's very difficult to game all of those.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
people may game a few, but then some of that gaming will be detectable, and they will fail in other aspects if they
Mm-hmm.
just are out there to game the process.